Tamara Ellis sat in a dimly lit Ironvale courtroom, wrists cuffed, facing charges of embezzlement she never committed. The jury foreman's voice echoed, "Not guilty." Relief washed over her as murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd. But before she could exhale, Detective Victor Hargrove smirked from the gallery, whispering to Officer Roland Tate. The judge's gavel slammed, silencing the room. Tamara's attorney leaned in, voice grim. "This isn't over. What sinister plan were the cops hatching now?" Before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice, hit like and subscribe, because tomorrow's episode will leave you speechless. Detective Victor Hargrove leaned back in a creaky wooden chair inside the Rusty Anchor, a smoky dive bar tucked away in a forgotten corner of Ironvale, Ohio. The air stank of stale beer and cigarette ash, but the dim lighting suited his mood perfectly. Across the scratched table sat Officer Roland Tate, his meaty fingers wrapped around a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey. Both men wore scowls that could curdle milk, their eyes glinting with a shared fury that had simmered since the courtroom verdict earlier that day. Tamara Ellis, a 34-year-old black paralegal who had dared to cross them, had walked free. Not guilty. The word still burned in Hargrove's gut like a swallowed ember, and he slammed his glass down hard enough to make the table shudder. They had spent months crafting the perfect frame-up, forging financial records that painted Tamara as a thief who'd siphoned thousands from her law firm's accounts. They'd slipped crisp stacks of cash to Judge Caldwell, a man whose gambling debts made him as pliable as wet clay. Caldwell had promised to steer the trial their way, ensuring a conviction that would bury Tamara's reputation and silence her activism against police brutality in Ironvale. She'd been a thorn in their side for too long, organizing protests, filing complaints, and rallying the city's black community against their so-called law enforcement. Hargrove had relished the thought of watching her crumble in that courtroom, her dreams of becoming a prosecutor snuffed out like a candle in a storm. But the jury had seen through the lies, or at least enough of them, and now she was free. Worse, her acquittal threatened the delicate web of power they'd spun across Ironvale, a web that kept their pockets lined and their authority unchallenged. Tate drained his whiskey in one gulp, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as he growled under his breath. His buzz cut glistened with sweat under the bar's flickering neon sign, and his knuckles were still bruised from a recent interrogation that had gone a little too far. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over. The jukebox blaring some mournful country tune in the corner. They couldn't let this stand, he insisted. Tamara's win wasn't just a personal slight, it was a crack in the dam. If she gained any more traction, if people started believing her stories about corrupt cops and rigged systems, their whole operation could come crashing down. Bribes, planted evidence, shakedowns of local dealers, all of it could be exposed. Hargrove nodded, his sharp jaw tightening as he swirled the last dregs of his drink. They needed to hit her where it hurt, somewhere that would make her think twice about playing hero again, somewhere personal. Hargrove's mind churned like a machine, cold and precise, as he mapped out their next move. He'd seen how close Tamara was to her family during the trial, how her sister Keisha had sat in the gallery every day, clutching a worn Bible and whispering prayers under her breath. Keisha Ellis was a single mother, barely scraping by on a waitress's tips, with a 10-year-old son named Malik who idolized his Aunt Tamara. Hargrove had always known family was a weak spot for do-gooders like her, a pressure point that could break even the toughest spirits. He proposed a plan so vicious it made Tate's lips curl into a cruel grin. They'd target Keisha, rip her life apart, and let Tamara feel the collateral damage. It wouldn't just hurt her, it would send a message. To anyone else in Ironvale dumb enough to challenge their reign, the scheme came together quickly, fueled by whiskey and spite. Hargrove had a buddy in Child Protective Services, a Weasley caseworker named Greg Dunham, who owed him favors after Hargrove had lost some incriminating photos of Dunham at a strip club. All it took was a late-night phone call and a promise of $500 to get Dunham on board. Hargrove fed him a string of lies about Keisha, claims of neglect, drug use, and unsafe living conditions, none of which held a shred of truth. Dunham didn't care about the details. He typed up a report littered with buzzwords like imminent risk and unfit environment, knowing it would trigger an immediate response. By midnight, the paperwork was filed, and a CPS raid was scheduled for Keisha's apartment in the rundown Clover Heights neighborhood. Hargrove and Tate didn't stop there. They wanted the raid to be a spectacle, something Ironvale wouldn't forget. Hargrove called in a tip to a local news station, claiming an anonymous source had uncovered a major child welfare scandal involving a prominent activist's family. The vultures at Channel 7 ate it up, dispatching a van to stake out Keisha's place before dawn. Tate, meanwhile, greased the wheels with a couple of patrol officers, ensuring they'd show up in full force to assist CPS, complete, with flashing lights and drawn weapons. The goal wasn't just to take Keisha's kid. It was to humiliate her, to paint the whole Ellis family as a den of dysfunction, dragging Tamara's name through the mud in the process. At 2 in the morning, the raid hit like a thunderclap. Keisha's apartment door splintered under the force of a battering ram as CPS workers and cops stormed inside, their shouts echoing down the cracked hallways of Clover Heights. Keisha jolted awake in her threadbare bed, her heart slamming against her ribs. Hare's flashlight beams sliced through the darkness. Malik screamed from his tiny bedroom, his voice high and panicked, as a burly officer in riot gear yanked him out from under his Spider-Man blanket. Keisha stumbled into the living room in her nightgown, her eyes wild with terror, begging to know what was happening. Dunham stood in the center of the chaos, clipboard in hand, reciting the fabricated charges in a monotone drone. Suspected drug use, failure to provide a safe environment, reports of neglect. Keisha's protests fell on deaf ears as Malik was dragged outside, his bare feet scraping the cold linoleum, tears streaming down his face as he called for his mama. The neighbors, roused by the commotion, gathered on their stoops, whispering, behind cupped hands, as the Channel 7 camera crew captured every moment. The cops made a show of searching the apartment, tossing drawers and flipping mattresses, though they found nothing incriminating beyond a half-empty bottle of cough. Syrup on the kitchen counter. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Malik was bundled into a CPS van, his cries muffled by the slamming door, while Keisha collapsed to her knees in the doorway, clutching her chest as if her heart might burst. The reporter, a blonde woman, in a too-tight blazer, shoved a microphone in her face, asking if she had any comment on the allegations. Keisha could barely choke out a sob before the camera panned away, framing the scene for maximum drama. Hargrove watched it all unfold from an unmarked car parked a block away, a cigarette glowing between his fingers as he listened to the chatter on his police radio. Tate sat beside him, chuckling darkly as the reporter's voice crackled through the feed, already spinning the story into a tale of urban decay and broken families. They knew Tamara would hear about this before sunrise. Hell, she'd probably be at Keisha's door before the news hit the morning papers. That was the point. Let her see what happened when she crossed them. Let her feel the weight of her sister's pain, her nephew's absence, and know it was all because of her. Hargrove flicked his cigarette butt out the window, the ember sparking briefly against the asphalt, before fading into the night. He didn't say a word, but the smirk on his face mirrored the one he'd worn in the courtroom earlier that day. The time the CPS van pulled away with Malik inside, the rusty anchor had long since closed its doors, but Hargrove and Tate lingered in their car, plotting the next phase over a pack of smokes and a thermos of bitter coffee. They'd struck a blow, one that would leave Tamara reeling, but they weren't done. Not by a long shot. She'd humiliated them in court, turned their carefully laid plans to ash, and now her sister's tears were just the opening salvo. Hargrove cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the cramped car, and muttered about making sure Tamara never forgot who really ran Ironvale. Tate nodded, his eyes gleaming with a vicious kind of hunger. They'd break her, piece by piece, until she was nothing but a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of this rotting city. Tamara Ellis barely had time to process the courtroom victory before her phone buzzed with a string of frantic texts from her sister Keisha. It was just past 3 in the morning, and the messages were a chaotic jumble of words. CPS took Malik. Cops everywhere. Please come. Her heart plummeted into her stomach as she threw on a jacket and raced across Ironvale's darkened streets, the city's sodium vapor glow casting long shadows that seemed to claw at her tires. Clover Heights loomed ahead, its crumbling tenements, a stark reminder of the poverty her sister fought against every day. When Tamara burst through Keisha's door, the sight before her ripped the air from her lungs. Keisha sat crumpled on the floor, surrounded by overturned furniture and shattered glass, her nightgown stained with tears. She looked up, eyes red and swollen, and choked out a sob that broke Tamara's heart clean in two. The apartment was a war zone, drawers yanked open, mattresses flipped, a child's toy truck crushed under a bootprint that didn't belong to anyone who lived there. Keisha's voice trembled as she recounted the midnight raid, the cops and CPS workers storming in like an invading army, their shouts drowning out Malik's terrified screams. They'd taken him, claiming neglect and drug use, accusations so far from the truth they might as well have been written in a foreign language. Tamara knelt beside her sister, wrapping her in a fierce embrace, feeling Keisha's shuddering breaths against her chest. She whispered promises into her hair, vowing to get Malik back to fix this nightmare, even as her mind raced with the sickening realization that this was no random cruelty. This had Hargrove and Tate written all over it, their fingerprints invisible but unmistakable in the chaos left behind. Tamara's paralegal training kicked into overdrive, her grief hardening into resolve as she helped Keisha to her feet and started brewing a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They couldn't afford to collapse. Not now, not when Malik needed them most. She grabbed her laptop and a stack of legal pads from her bag, setting up a makeshift war room on Keisha's wobbly kitchen table. First, she needed facts. Keisha recounted every detail she could remember. The CPS worker's name, Greg Dunham. The cops who'd smirked as they tore through her home. The reporter who'd shoved a microphone in her face like she was some kind of circus act. Tamara scribbled furiously, her pen scratching against the paper as she pieced together a timeline. It was clear the raid was orchestrated, the accusations baseless, but proving it would take more than outrage. It would take evidence, witnesses, and a fight against a system that chewed up families like hers for breakfast. She started with the neighbors, knocking on doors at dawn despite the risk of drawing attention from whoever had set this in motion. Mrs. Carter from across the hall, a grandmother with a voice like gravel, swore she'd seen a cop slip something into his pocket during the raid, though she couldn't be sure what. Mr. Lopez down the stairwell, a night shift mechanic still, in his grease-stained overalls, confirmed he'd heard Malik crying for his mother as the CPS van sped off, no drugs or danger in sight. Tamara collected their statements with meticulous care, typing affidavits on her laptop as Keisha watched with hollow eyes, clutching a cold mug of coffee like a lifeline. Each word felt like a brick in the wall she was building to protect her family, but she knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. CPS didn't care about truth when the orders came from above. She needed to expose the lies at their root. Next, she dug into the CPS report itself, using her old law firm contacts to get a copy faxed over by midday. The document was a masterclass in fabrication, littered with vague claims of unsafe conditions and suspected substance abuse without a shred of proof. Tamara's sharp eyes caught inconsistencies that made her blood boil. The report claimed a neighbor had called in the tip at 10 in the evening, but Mrs. Carter insisted she'd been at bingo until midnight and heard no such thing. The timeline. Some of the raid didn't match Keisha's account either. CPS claimed they'd knocked first, but the splintered doorframe told a different story. Tamara highlighted every discrepancy, her fingers trembling with a mix of rage and hope. If she could prove the report was a sham, she could force a hearing to get Malik back. For 3 sleepless nights, Tamara worked without pause, fueled by black coffee and sheer determination. She drafted an emergency appeal to CPS, attaching the affidavits and a scathing breakdown of the report's flaws. She called in favors from former colleagues at the law firm, begging for pro bono representation since her own funds were stretched thin after the trial. A junior attorney named Marcus Wells agreed to take the case, his voice crackling with indignation over the phone, as he read through her notes. Together, they filed the appeal and secured a hearing date at the Ironvale Family Court. a squat brick building that loomed like a fortress on the edge of downtown. Tamara barely slept in the days leading up to it, her dreams haunted by Malik's cries and the smirk Hargrove had worn in the courtroom. The hearing was a battle from the start. Greg Dunham sat across the room in a cheap suit, his shifty eyes darting between Tamara and the judge, a stern older woman named Judge Harriet Langston, who'd seen her share of CPS cases. Dunham repeated the report's lies with a practiced monotone, claiming Keisha's apartment had been unfit and that Malik was at risk. Tamara's hands clenched into fists under the table as Marcus presented their case, laying out the affidavits, the timeline discrepancies, and the lack of physical evidence. He called Mrs. Carter to the stand, her testimony unwavering as she recounted the night of the raid, her voice trembling with anger at the injustice she'd witnessed. Mr. Lopez followed, his quiet sincerity cutting through Dunham's flimsy excuses like a knife through butter. Judge Langston's brow furrowed deeper with each piece of evidence, her pen scratching notes as Marcus spoke. Tamara held her breath when the judge finally turned to Dunham, her voice sharp as she demanded to know why no drug tests had been administered to Keisha, why no physical evidence supported the claims, and why the neighbor's accounts contradicted his report. Dunham stammered, sweat beading on his forehead, his excuses unraveling faster than a cheap sweater. After a tense hour of deliberation, Judge Langston delivered her ruling. The CPS report lacked credible evidence, and Malik was to be returned to Keisha immediately, pending a follow-up review. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps, and Tamara felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly knocked her off her feet. She drove straight to the foster facility with Keisha, her sister clutching the court order like a sacred relic. Malik ran into Keisha's arms the moment he saw her, his small body shaking with sobs as he buried his face in her neck. Tamara knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around them both, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered apologies for not protecting them sooner. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, she could outsmart the system that had tried to crush them. They drove back to Clover Heights under a grey sky, the city's jagged skyline softened by the promise of a new start. Tamara watched Malik giggle in the back seat, his tiny hand clutching a juice box, and let herself believe they'd dodged the worst of it. But as they pulled into Keisha's parking lot, a chill crept up Tamara's spine. A black sedan idled across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the fading light. She couldn't see who was inside, but she didn't need to. Hargrove and Tate weren't the type to let a loss slide, and she'd just painted a bigger target, on her back. What lengths would they go to now to make her pay? If you think Tamara deserves justice after this heart-wrenching fight, comment number 1 down below, hit that like button, and subscribe to catch what happens next. Did Hargrove and Tate just watch from the shadows, or are they already planning something far worse? Officer Roland Tate slouched in the passenger seat of an unmarked sedan parked just beyond the flickering streetlights of Clover Heights, his thick fingers drumming a restless beat on the dashboard. The night air was thick with the scent of rain and rust, a fitting backdrop for the seething anger that churned in his gut. Across from him, Detective Victor Hargrove gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his sharp features cast in shadow by the dim glow of a cigarette dangling from his lips. They'd watched the whole scene unfold. Tamara Ellis pulling into the lot with her sister Keisha and nephew Malik, the kid clutching a juice box like it was a lifeline, the three of them laughing through tears as they climbed the cracked steps to Keisha's apartment. It should have been a gut punch to see Tamara win again, to see her snatch her nephew back from CPS's claws after they'd pulled every string to make it happen. But Hargrove's smirk held no hint of defeat. If anything, it was sharper, hungrier, a predator biding its time before the kill. Tate crushed an empty beer can in his fist, the aluminum crumpling with a satisfying crunch as he spat out a curse that would have made a sailor blush. His buzz cut glistened with sweat despite the chill, and his bruised knuckles twitched with the urge to break something, anything, to vent the fury boiling inside him. They'd lost twice now, first in the courtroom, where Tamara's not guilty verdict had turned their embezzlement frame-up into a public embarrassment, and now here with her CPS victory making headlines in the Ironvale Chronicle. The story was spreading like wildfire, painting her as some kind of martyr for justice, a black woman standing up to a corrupt system and winning. It made Tate's stomach churn. She wasn't just a thorn in their side anymore. She was a whole damn forest, choking out the shadows where they operated. If the city started believing her, if protests grew louder and investigations dug deeper, their empire of bribes and planted evidence could collapse like a house of cards. Hargrove exhaled a plume of smoke, the ember flaring briefly as he flicked the cigarette butt out the window. He didn't need to say it. Tate could feel the same thought pulsing between them. They'd underestimated Tamara, thought a rigged trial would break her, thought CPS would crush her spirit through her sisters. Pain. But she'd fought back, harder and smarter than they'd expected. And now the whispers in Ironvale were turning into shouts. Community organizers were rallying, journalists were sniffing around, and even some of the precinct's rank and file were starting to question their methods. Hargrove had caught a rookie cop giving him a side-eye in the break room yesterday, and it had taken every ounce of restraint not to slam the kid's head into the vending machine. They needed to send a message, something louder than paperwork. And courtrooms, something that would make Tamara and anyone else think twice before crossing them again. The idea came to Hargrove like a lightning strike, cold and brutal and perfect. They'd hit her with violence, something raw and undeniable, a warning carved in fire and fear. He turned to Tate, his voice low and deliberate, each word dripping with venom as he laid out the plan. They'd burn Tamara's car, torch it right, there in the parking lot outside Keisha's place, where she'd see it, where the whole neighborhood would see it. It wasn't enough to just destroy her property. They needed spectacle, chaos, something the Ironvale Chronicle couldn't spin into another sob story about resilience. Tate's eyes gleamed with approval, a vicious grin splitting his face as he cracked his knuckles in anticipation. He knew just the guy for the job, a small-time thug named Eddie Voss, a wiry ex-con who'd do anything for a couple $100 and a pack of smokes. Eddie had a rap sheet longer than a CVS receipt, mostly petty theft and bar fights, but he'd torched a rival's garage once and walked away clean. He'd be perfect. Hargrove made the call from a burner phone, his voice clipped and professional. As he gave Eddie the rundown, Tamara's car, a beat-up silver Honda parked in the Clover Heights lot, needed to go up in flames tonight. No questions, no witnesses, just a Molotov cocktail through the windshield and a quick exit. Eddie grunted, his agreement, already slurring from a half-empty bottle of vodka, and promised it'd be done by midnight. Hargrove hung up and leaned back in his seat, satisfaction curling in his chest like a well-fed cat. He pictured Tamara's face when she saw the blaze, the way her hope would melt into terror, the way Keisha would scream and Malik would cry. It wasn't just about the car. It was about showing her they could reach her anywhere, anytime, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. Midnight came fast, the moon hidden behind a shroud of clouds, as Eddie crept through the shadows of Clover Heights, a glass bottle stuffed with gasoline-soaked rags clutched in his gloved hand. The parking lot was quiet, most of the residents asleep or huddled inside, the only sound the distant bark of a stray dog and the hum of a flickering streetlight. Tamara's Honda sat near the edge of the lot, its dented fender catching the faint glow of the bulb overhead. Eddie lit the rag with a cheap lighter, the flame dancing orange and yellow as he took a swig from his flask for courage. He hurled, the bottle with a grunt, the glass shattering against the windshield in a burst of fire that roared to life with terrifying speed. The flame spread across the hood, licking up the sides of the car as the interior caught, black smoke billowing into the night sky like a signal flare. Inside Keisha's apartment, Tamara jolted awake on the couch, her neck stiff from dozing off while reviewing case files. The smell of smoke hit her first, acrid and sharp, followed by the crackle of flames and the sudden shouts of neighbors spilling out onto their stoops. She stumbled to the window, her heart slamming against her ribs as she saw the inferno consuming her car. Orange and red tongues danced in the darkness, casting grotesque shadows across the pavement, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Keisha burst into the living room, her eyes wide with panic, Malik clinging to her leg with a whimper. Tamara grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she reported the fire, but deep down she knew who was behind it. This wasn't random vandalism, this was Hargrove and Tate, their retaliation written in gasoline and shattered glass. The fire department arrived 10 minutes later, sirens wailing as they doused the blaze with hoses, but the car was already a charred husk, its frame twisted and blackened beyond recognition. Neighbors huddled in clusters, whispering about gangs or accidents, but Tamara saw the truth in the way the responding cops moved. 2 officers from the Ironvale precinct, men she recognized from the raid on Keisha's place, strolled through the scene with smirks tugging at their lips. One of them, a stocky guy with a crooked nose, approached her as she stood shivering. In her jacket, Keisha's arm looped through hers for support. He didn't even pretend to investigate, just scratched his chin and muttered something about how she must have provoked the wrong people. When Tamara demanded they check for arson, he laughed, a harsh bark that made Malik flinch, and said they'd look into it. But by morning, the police report listed the fire as undetermined origin, and the evidence bags containing shards of the Molotov bottle had mysteriously vanished from the precinct's lockup. Hargrove watched the aftermath from a safe distance, parked on a side street with a clear view of the smouldering wreckage. He lit another cigarette, the glow reflecting in his cold eyes as he listened to the scanner crackle with updates. Tate sat beside him, chuckling low as he scrolled through. Grainy footage of the fire on his phone, captured by some kid in the neighborhood who'd already posted it online. The comments were a mix of shock and blame, some calling Tamara reckless, others swearing it was a setup. Either way, it was working. Fear was spreading, and Hargrove could feel it seeping into the cracks of Clover Heights like poison. He exhaled. A slow stream of smoke, his smirk widening as he imagined Tamara's face when she realized this was only the beginning. They'd struck hard, but they could strike harder, and they would. Tamara Ellis stood trembling in the cold dawn light of Clover Heights, her arms wrapped tight around her chest, as the last wisps of smoke curled up from the charred skeleton of her Honda. The firebombing had left her shaken to her core, the acrid stench of burned rubber and gasoline clinging to her clothes like a second skin. Keisha hovered beside her, one hand clutching Malik's small shoulder, the other wiping tears from her puffy eyes. The neighbors had retreated to their apartments, leaving behind whispers of fear and speculation. But Tamara couldn't shake. The image of the cops' smirks or the way they'd dismissed her pleas for justice. Her car wasn't just a pile of twisted metal. It was a warning, a blazing neon sign that Hargrove and Tate weren't done with her yet. She'd beaten them. In court, clawed her nephew back from CPS, but this was different. This was violence, raw and personal, and it left her feeling exposed, a target painted in fire for all of Ironvale to see. Sleep was out of the question, her mind racing with every creak of Keisha's apartment building, every shadow that flickered past the window. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let her sister and nephew live under this threat. By mid-morning, she'd made a decision, one born of desperation and a stubborn refusal to break. She needed help, real help, not just lawyers, or neighbors with shaky stories. She needed people who understood the fight, who'd faced down the same monsters and lived to tell about it. Her thoughts turned to Jamal Carter, a name she'd heard at every protest and community meeting in Ironvale. He was a 30-something, activist with a voice that could shake walls, a man who'd spent years rallying the city's black residents against police brutality. If anyone could shield her family and push back against Hargrove's reign of terror, it was him. Tamara found Jamal at a rundown community center on the east side of Ironvale, its peeling paint and cracked windows a testament to the city's neglect. He was mid-speech when she walked in, his deep timbre booming over a crowd of 24 locals gathered on folding chairs. He wore a faded denim jacket and a scowl that softened when he spotted her hovering near the door. She waited until he finished, her nerves jangling like loose change as he strode over, his broad frame towering over her slight one. She spilled everything in a rush, the trial, the CPS raid, the firebombing, her voice cracking as she described the flames licking up her car's hood. Jamal listened without interrupting, his dark eyes narrowing with each detail, and when she finished he nodded once, sharp and decisive. He'd heard about her, he said, the paralegal who'd beaten the system twice. He'd help her, no question. Within hours, Jamal had mobilized his group, a tight-knit crew of organizers who moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. They whisked Tamara, Keisha and Malik to a safe house on the outskirts of Ironvale, a small brick bungalow hidden behind overgrown hedges and a rusty chain-link fence. The place smelled of mothballs and old wood, but it had sturdy locks and a back door that led to an alley for quick escapes. Tamara exhaled for the first time in days as Malik giggled over a bowl of cereal at the kitchen table, Keisha's tense shoulders finally easing as she unpacked a duffel bag of clothes. Jamal's people promised round-the-clock watch shifts, volunteers with walkie-talkies and grim determination keeping an eye out for trouble. It wasn't luxury, but it was safety, and that was more than Tamara had dared to hope for. Jamal didn't stop there. He introduced her to Lena Harper, a rogue journalist who'd been sniffing around Ironvale's underbelly for years, her byline a regular feature in the Ironvale Chronicle's less popular back pages. Lena was a wiry woman in her 40s, with a mop of grey-streaked curls and a notepad perpetually tucked under her arm. She met Tamara at the safe house that evening, her sharp green eyes glinting with curiosity as she listened to the story. The firebombing wasn't just an attack, Lena mused aloud, scribbling notes in a shorthand Tamara couldn't decipher. It was a lead. She'd been chasing rumors of police corruption for months, piecing together whispers of Hargrove's dirty deals, and this could be the break she needed. Tamara hesitated, her trust battered by the past week, but Lena's quiet intensity won her over. They struck a deal. Lena would dig, and Tamara would feed her whatever she could remember from the CE trial and the raid. It took Lena 3 days to strike gold. She tracked down Eddie Voss, the thug who'd torched Tamara's car, through a network of barflies and petty crooks who owed her favors. Eddie was holed up in a flop house downtown, strung out on cheap vodka and paranoia, and it didn't take much to get him talking. A couple of 20s and a promise of anonymity loosened his tongue, and he spilled the details. Hargrove had hired him, paid him $200 cash in a back alley behind the Rusty Anchor, told him exactly where to find the Honda and when to strike. Lena recorded every word on her phone, her lips curling into a triumphant smirk as Eddie's slurred confession painted a damning picture. She cross-checked it with precinct logs, finding gaps where Hargrove's whereabouts were unaccounted for that night, a paper trail that tied him to the crime like a noose around his neck. Tamara felt a surge of adrenaline when Lena showed up. At the safe house with the evidence, a manila folder stuffed with transcripts and blurry photos of Hargrove meeting Eddie in the alley. They worked late into the night, crafting an exposé that would hit Ironvale like a sledgehammer. Lena's prose was sharp and unrelenting, detailing the firebombing, Eddie's confession and Hargrove's history of brutality, while Tamara added her own account of the trial and CPS raid to frame it as a pattern of systemic racism. The Ironvale Chronicle ran it on the front page the next morning, the headline screaming in bold black letters, "Corrupt cops target black paralegal in violent revenge plot." By noon it was everywhere, shared across social media, picked up by local TV stations, the words Tamara Ellis and police corruption buzzing through Ironvale's streets like an electric current. Protests erupted outside the precinct. By dusk, a sea of angry faces and handmade signs clogging the intersection of 5th and Main. Jamal led the charge, his megaphone blaring demands for Hargrove's arrest as the crowd chanted Tamara's name, their voices rising over the honks of stalled traffic. Tamara watched from the safe house window, her chest tight with a mix of pride and fear, as Malik pressed his nose to the glass beside her, asking if the people were mad at Aunt Tammy. She forced a smile, ruffling his hair, and said they were fighting for her, for all of them. The city seemed to tilt in her favor, the Chronicle's exposé giving her a shield she hadn't had before, a fragile alliance of activists and truth-seekers standing between her and the cops' wrath. For the first time since the courtroom, she let herself believe she was turning the tide, that Hargrove and Tate might finally face consequences. But as the chants echoed into the night, a shadow lingered at the edge of her mind. Hargrove wasn't the type to slink away quietly, and Tate's silence felt too heavy, too deliberate. She'd struck a blow, but at what cost? If you think Tamara's courage deserves to shake this corrupt city to its core, comment number 1. Pillow? Should she trust this newfound support, or is it all too good to be true? Hit like and subscribe to find out what's next, because the fight's heating up. What will Hargrove do when his name's plastered across every headline in Ironvale? Detective Victor Hargrove paced the cluttered back office of the Ironvale precinct, his boots scuffing the worn linoleum as he chewed on the end of an unlit cigar. The room smelled of stale coffee and sweat, its walls plastered with faded wanted, posters and a corkboard pinned with mugshots of petty crooks who'd never see the inside of a cell thanks to his deals. Officer Roland Tate sprawled in a rickety chair by the desk, his thick arms crossed over his chest, a vein pulsing in his temple as he stared at the front page of the Ironvale Chronicle crumpled in his fist. The headline screamed in bold black, "Inc. Corrupt cops target black paralegal in violent revenge plot." Tamara Ellis's name was everywhere. Her face splashed across the paper alongside grainy photos of her burned-out car and quotes from that nosy journalist, Lena Harper. Hargrove's stomach twisted with a fury so hot it felt like it might melt his bones. The protests outside had been raging for hours, a relentless roar of voices and footsteps that seeped through the precinct's grimy windows, rattling the glass. With every chant of "Justice for Tamara," Hargrove had stood at the edge of the crowd earlier, his cap pulled low, watching Jamal Carter whip the mob into a frenzy with his megaphone. The sight made his blood boil, not just because of the noise or the signs demanding his arrest, but because of what it meant. Tamara wasn't just winning. She was turning Ironvale against them, peeling back the layers of fear and silence they'd spent years building. The exposé had hit like a freight train, Eddie Voss's drunken confession linking Hargrove to the firebombing now echoing through every bar and barbershop in the city. Tate slammed the paper onto the desk, his voice a gravelly snarl as he muttered about how they should have killed her outright, saved themselves the headache of this slow bleed. Hargrove stopped pacing, his sharp jaw tightening as he crushed the cigar between his fingers, flakes of tobacco scattering across the floor. Killing her outright would have been cleaner, sure, but too messy in the fallout. Too many eyes were on them now, federal whispers starting to hum through the precinct's rumor mill. They needed something subtler, something that would bury Tamara, without leaving their prints on the shovel. His mind churned, replaying every move she'd made, every ally she'd gained, until it snagged on Jamal Carter. The activist had swooped in like some kind of savior, hiding Tamara in that safe house, rallying the troops, making himself her shield. But Hargrove knew men like Jamal, loud on the outside, hollow where it counted. He'd seen the cracks in the guy's armor before, a gambling habit he kept quiet, a sister in jail he couldn't bail out. Jamal wasn't untouchable. He was buyable. Tate leaned forward, catching the glint in Hargrove's eye, and cracked a grin that showed too many teeth. They didn't need to say much. Years of working together had honed their shorthand to a razor's edge. Hargrove pulled out a burner phone and dialed a number he'd used a dozen times before, a fixer named Tony Russo, who specialized in turning friends into snitches. Tony picked up on the second ring, his voice oily and eager as Hargrove laid out the play. Find. Jamal offered him cash, enough to clear his debts and spring his sister from lockup. In return, Jamal would plant drugs in Tamara's safe house and tip them off for a raid. Tony laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender, and said he'd have it done by nightfall. Hargrove hung up and tossed the phone onto the desk, satisfaction curling in his chest as he pictured Tamara's face when the cuffs snapped back on. Tony found Jamal at a dive bar on the edge of Ironvale, nursing a beer and a stack of losing betting slips. The activist's broad shoulders slumped under the weight of his troubles, his denim jacket patched at the elbows from too many lean months. Tony slid into the booth across from him, a wad of cash peeking out of his coat pocket, and made his pitch, $10,000 clean and untraceable, plus a guarantee his sister would walk free by week's end. All Jamal had to do was slip a bag of coke into Tamara's safe house and make an anonymous call to the precinct. Jamal's jaw tightened, his fists clenching around the beer bottle as he stared at the money, then at Tony's smug face. He hated. Hargrove hated Tate, had spent years fighting their kind, but the thought of his sister rotting in a cell and his own debts piling up gnawed at him like a rat in a trap. After a long silence, he nodded once, his voice barely a whisper as he agreed. By midnight, Jamal was at the safe house, his heart pounding as he slipped past the volunteer on watch, a sleepy kid who didn't notice the creak of the back door. The bungalow was quiet. Tamara and Keisha asleep in the cramped bedrooms, Malik's soft snores drifting from a pile of blankets on the couch. Jamal's hands shook as he pulled a baggie of white powder from his pocket, the weight of it heavier than the cash Tony had handed him earlier. He tucked it behind a loose baseboard. In the kitchen, his breath hitching as he dialed the precinct from a payphone 2 blocks away. His voice trembled as he muttered about a drug stash at the safe house, giving the address before hanging up and disappearing into the night, guilt clawing at his throat like a living thing. Hargrove and Tate moved fast, calling in a SWAT team, under the guise of a credible tip about a major drug operation. At dawn, the safe house erupted in chaos as armored officers smashed through the front door, their shouts splitting the air like thunder. Tamara jolted awake, her pulse racing as flashlights blinded her, gloved hands yanking her from the bed and onto the floor. Keisha screamed from the next room, Malik's wails piercing the din as cops tore through the place, flipping furniture and ripping cushions apart. Hargrove strode in behind the team, his smirk back in full force as he watched. An officer pulled the baggie from the baseboard, holding it up like a trophy. Tamara's stomach dropped, her mind scrambling to make sense of the betrayal as the cuffs snapped around her wrists, cold steel biting into her skin. The raid was a public spectacle, neighbors gawking from their yards as Tamara was dragged out, in her pajamas, her bare feet scraping the gravel driveway. Keisha clutched Malik to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she yelled that it was a setup. But the cops ignored her, their radios crackling with orders to haul Tamara downtown. Hargrove personally read her the charges: possession with intent to distribute, a felony that could lock her away for decades. He leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, as he muttered that she should have stayed quiet, should have known her place. Tate laughed from the sidelines, snapping photos with his phone as the SWAT team loaded her into a van, the doors slamming shut with a finality that echoed through Clover Heights. At the precinct, Judge Caldwell was waiting, his gambling debt still chaining him to Hargrove's whims. Hargrove had called him an hour before the raid, promising another payout if he sealed the deal. Caldwell sat in his chambers, his hands trembling as he signed the order denying Tamara bail, citing her as a danger to the community based on the planted evidence and her history of inciting unrest. He didn't meet her eyes when she was hauled before him later that day, her wrists still cuffed, her voice hoarse as she pleaded her innocence. The gavel fell like a guillotine, and she was carted off to a holding cell, the clang of the bars shutting out the world she'd fought so hard to change. Hargrove leaned against the precinct wall as the van pulled away, lighting a cigarette with a flick of his lighter. Tate joined him, his grin wide enough to split his face as he scrolled through the photos, already plotting how to leak them to the press. They'd turned Tamara's triumph into a nightmare, flipped the script so fast the protests would stutter and die. Hargrove exhaled a slow stream of smoke, his eyes glinting with a savage kind of pride. She'd thought she could outrun them, thought her little exposé would bring them down. Now she was back where she belonged, and they were just getting started. Tamara Ellis sat on the edge of a thin metal bunk in a grimy Ironvale holding cell, her knees pulled tight to her chest as the damp concrete walls seemed to close in around her. The air reeked of mildew and despair, the faint hum of fluorescent, lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry wasps. Her wrists still ached from the cuffs that had bitten into her skin during the SWAT raid, and her pajamas hung loose and wrinkled, a humiliating reminder of how fast her world had shattered. Hours ago she'd been in the safe house, Malik's snores a quiet comfort, Keisha's breathing steady in the next room. Now she was here, locked away on trumped-up drug charges, the baggie of cocaine planted by someone she'd trusted with, her life. Hargrove's smirk as he'd read the charges lingered in her mind, his words a venomous hiss. She should have known her place. But even as despair clawed at her throat, an ember of defiance flickered in her chest, refusing to let her break. The cell block was a cacophony of clanging bars and muffled shouts, inmates pacing their cages like trapped animals. But Tamara tuned it out, her mind racing through every detail of the raid. Jamal Carter's face flashed before her, his broad shoulders and fiery speeches now tainted by the sting of betrayal. She'd trusted him, leaned on him when the firebombing had left her nowhere else to turn, and he'd sold her out. Why? Money. Fear. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The drugs weren't hers, but the system didn't care about truth. When Hargrove and Tate pulled the strings, Judge Caldwell's gavel had fallen like a death knell, denying her bail. With a flick of his wrist, his eyes avoiding hers as he muttered about her being a danger. She knew he was in their pocket. His gambling debts a leash they'd yanked to keep her caged. But she wasn't done fighting, not yet. Days bled into nights, the cell's monotony broken only by the clatter of meal trays and the occasional jeer from a guard. Tamara's spirit teetered on the edge, her body aching from the hard bunk, her mind haunted by Keisha's screams and Malik's terrified face as the SWAT team dragged her away. But then she met Officer Nadia Brooks, a young guard, with a quiet strength that cut through the jail's bleakness like a ray of sunlight. Nadia worked the night shift, her dark braids pulled back in a neat bun, her brown eyes sharp but kind as she patrolled the block. It started small, a nod when she slid Tamara's tray under the bars, a murmured, "Hang in there," when no one else was listening. Tamara caught the flicker of doubt in Nadia's gaze, the way she lingered a beat too long, and sensed an ally where she'd least expected one. One night, as the cell block settled into an uneasy quiet, Nadia paused outside Tamara's cell, her boots scuffing the floor as she glanced over her shoulder. She whispered through the bars, her voice barely audible over the hum of the lights, asking if Tamara was really guilty. Tamara met her eyes, steady and unflinching, and told her the truth. The drugs were planted, Hargrove and Tate were behind it, and she'd been framed to silence her fight against their corruption. Nadia's jaw tightened, her hand resting on the baton at her hip as she processed the words. She'd heard rumors about Hargrove, seen the way he swaggered through the precinct like he owned it. But this was different. This was a woman locked up for daring to speak out, and Nadia couldn't shake the feeling that it was wrong. She promised to help, her voice firm despite the risk, and slipped away before the next guard rounded the corner. 2 nights later, Nadia returned, her movements quick and cautious as she slid a burner phone through the bars, its cracked screen glowing faintly in the dim light. Tamara's breath caught as she clutched it, her fingers trembling with a mix of fear and hope. Nadia whispered that she'd gotten it from a friend outside, someone who owed her a favor, and urged Tamara to use it fast before the morning shift caught on. Tamara didn't waste a second, dialing Lena Harper's number from memory, her heart pounding as the line rang. Lena picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice groggy but sharpening, when she heard Tamara's plea. She begged Lena to keep digging, to find proof of the setup, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush as she described the raid and Jamal's betrayal. Lena swore she'd get to work, her tone fierce with determination, and the call cut off just as footsteps echoed down the hall. Lena didn't sleep that night, her cramped apartment a flurry of papers and coffee mugs as she chased every lead Tamara had given her. She started with Jamal, tracking him to a seedy motel on Ironvale's west side, where he'd holed up after the raid, his guilt driving him into hiding. She cornered him in his room, the stench of beer and regret thick in the air, and pressed him until he cracked. He admitted to planting the drugs, his voice breaking as he confessed Hargrove had paid him through a fixer, $10,000 to betray the woman he'd sworn to protect. Lena's recorder caught every word, but she needed more. She dug into the streets, finding a junkie named Rico, who'd seen Jamal at the safe house that night, coerced by Tony Russo to keep quiet. Rico was twitchy, his eyes darting as he spilled the story for a 20 and a burger, confirming Jamal's role and linking it back to Hargrove's orders. Tamara clung to the burner phone like a lifeline, hiding it under her mattress during the day, her nerves fraying with every passing hour. She used it to call her attorney, Marcus Wells, late one night, whispering the details Lena had uncovered as Nadia kept watch. Marcus was furious, his voice crackling through the line as he promised to file a motion to dismiss based on the new evidence. He worked fast, drafting the paperwork with Lena's recordings and Rico's shaky affidavit, arguing the drugs were planted and the raid was a setup. The motion landed on Judge Langston's desk, the same stern woman who'd ruled in Tamara's favor during the CPS hearing, a rare untainted figure in Ironvale's crooked system. Tamara held her breath as the hearing date approached, her nights spent pacing the cell, her days dodging guards who might spot the phone. The hearing was a grueling marathon, stretching over 2 weeks as Marcus battled the prosecution's flimsy case. He presented Lena's evidence, calling Rico to the stand where the junkie fidgeted but stuck to his story, his voice trembling as he pointed the finger at Jamal and Hargrove. Jamal refused to testify, his silence damning him further, as Marcus played the recording of his confession, the motel room's background hum underscoring his broken words. The prosecution scrambled, claiming Rico was unreliable, but Judge Langston's eyes narrowed with each inconsistency they couldn't explain. Tamara sat in the courtroom, her hands cuffed but her head high, watching the tide turn as Nadia stood guard at the back, her presence a quiet anchor. After days of deliberation, Langston delivered her ruling. The evidence was tainted, the charges lacked credibility, and Tamara was granted bail pending a full dismissal hearing. Tamara walked out of the jail that evening, the late autumn air sharp against her skin, as Keisha and Malik ran to her, their arms wrapping around her in a tangle of tears and laughter. She hugged them tight, her knees weak with relief, as she breathed free air for the first time in weeks. Marcus clapped her shoulder, promising the dismissal was just a formality now, while Lena grinned from the sidelines, her notepad already filling with notes for the next exposé. Tamara let herself believe she'd dodged the worst, that Hargrove and Tate's grip was slipping. The city buzzed with her release, whispers of justice cutting through the precinct's shadow. But as she climbed into Keisha's car, a flicker of unease lingered. Hargrove hadn't shown his face, and that silence felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. If you think Tamara's grit pulled her through this nightmare, comment number 1 below. Does she deserve a break after fighting from a cell, or is the system still stacked against her? Hit like and subscribe to see her next move because the battle's far from over. What's Hargrove plotting in the shadows now that Tamara's free again? Officer Roland Tate leaned against the rusted railing of a derelict warehouse on Ironvale's south side, the Ohio River's muddy stench wafting up from the banks below. His thick frame cast a hulking shadow under the flickering sodium lights, his bruised knuckles flexing as he cracked open a fresh beer, the hiss of the can slicing through the night stillness. Beside him, Detective Victor Hargrove stood rigid, his sharp features etched with a fury that hadn't cooled since Tamara Ellis walked out of jail earlier that day. He chewed on a toothpick, the wood splintering between his teeth as he stared. Out at the city's jagged skyline, its twinkling lights mocking their latest defeat. The Ironvale Chronicle had already splashed her release across its front page, hailing her as a symbol of resilience, while whispers of federal probes into their precinct grew louder, buzzing through the streets like flies on a corpse. Tate took a long swig, the beer dribbling down his chin as he wiped it away with a grunt. His buzz cut glistened with sweat despite the autumn chill, and his voice rumbled low, thick with venom, as he muttered about how Tamara's bail felt like a personal slap across his face. She'd clawed her way out of their drug frame-up, turned, their betrayal by Jamal Carter into a weapon, and now she was free again, her allies louder than ever. Hargrove spat the toothpick onto the cracked pavement, his cold eyes narrowing as he replayed the courtroom scene in his mind. Judge Langston's stern ruling, Tamara's defiant stare, the way her sister and nephew had rushed to her like she was some kind of hero. It wasn't just a loss, it was an insult, a public gut punch that made their grip on Ironvale feel like sand slipping through their fingers. Hargrove's silence stretched taut, his mind a churning engine of spite and strategy as Tate ranted beside him. The protests were swelling, the exposé still burning through the city, and every cop in the precinct was starting to eye them warily, sensing the heat closing in. They'd tried legal traps, tried breaking her spirit through her family, tried burying her with drugs, and still she stood. Tate crushed the empty can in his fist, the aluminum crumpling with a sharp pop, and growled that they needed to end her, not just hurt her. Hargrove nodded once, slow and deliberate, his smirk curling back into place as a new plan crystallized. Words and paperwork weren't enough anymore. They needed blood, a strike so bold it would silence her and scare Ironvale into submission. They'd kill her publicly and twist it into a lesson no one would forget. The idea hit Tate like a spark to dry grass, his grin widening as Hargrove laid out the details. Tamara was set to speak at a community rally tomorrow night, a grassroots event organized by Jamal Carter's old crew to demand police accountability. It was the perfect stage, a crowd of her supporters, a public platform, a chance to make her a martyr and then flip the script. Hargrove knew a hitman, a guy named Vince Malone, a lean, quiet ex-soldier who'd done wet work for the mob before washing up in Ironvale's underworld. Vince didn't talk much, didn't ask questions, just took cash and left bodies. Hargrove pulled out his burner phone and dialed. His voice clipped as he offered Vince $5,000 to stage a drive-by shooting at the rally. Hit Tamara, make it messy, and let the chaos do the rest. Vince grunted his agreement, the line going dead as Hargrove pocketed the phone, satisfaction pooling in his gut like warm whiskey. Tate took the next step, his meaty hands itching to twist the knife deeper. He called a contact at Channel 7, a sleazy producer named Carla Ortiz who thrived on scandal and owed him for burying a DUI last year. He fed her a tip about the rally, hyping it as a powder keg of unrest, ensuring her crew would be there with cameras rolling when the bullets flew. The plan was simple but brutal. Vince would take out Tamara, the media would capture the carnage, and they'd spin it as her fault, claiming her radical activism had incited violence. Ironvale would eat it up, the protests would fizzle, and the feds would back off, blaming a dead woman instead of digging into their dirt. Hargrove lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his cold smirk as he pictured the headlines, "Activists Rally Turns Deadly, 2 Killed in Chaos." The next night came fast, the rally swelling in a vacant lot near Clover Heights under a sky bruised with storm clouds. Hundreds gathered, their voices rising in chants as candles flickered against the dusk, signs demanding justice bobbing above. The crowd. Tamara stood on a makeshift stage, her voice steady despite the bandage on her arm from the jail's rough handling, thanking the community for standing with her. Keisha and Malik watched from the sidelines, their faces lit with fragile hope as she spoke of accountability, of tearing down corruption brick by brick. Hargrove and Tate lurked in an unmarked car a block away, their radios tuned to Vince's frequency, waiting for the signal. At 8:32, a black pickup roared around the corner, its tinted windows glinting as the driver's side rolled down, revealing the glint of a gun barrel. Bullets ripped through the air, a deafening staccato. That turned the rally into a screaming mass of panic. The first shot grazed Tamara's arm, blood blooming through her sleeve as she dove behind the podium, her scream swallowed by the chaos. 2 bystanders weren't so lucky. A teenage boy crumpled to the ground, his chest a red ruin, and an elderly woman fell beside him, her candle snuffed out in a pool of crimson. The crowd scattered, shoes pounding pavement as the pickup peeled away, tires screeching into the night. Tamara crawled to the edge of the stage, her vision blurring with pain and terror as she saw the bodies, guilt crashing over her like a wave. Keisha rushed to her, Malik sobbing in her arms, their faces pale with shock as sirens wailed in the distance. Hargrove watched from the car, his cigarette glowing as the scanner crackled with reports of the shooting. Tate laughed, a harsh bark that echoed in the cramped space as he flipped on the TV feed from Channel 7. Carla's crew had caught it all, the gunfire, the bodies, Tamara's bloodied arm as she staggered to her feet. The anchor's voice trembled with rehearsed outrage, already spinning the story. A rally meant to protest police corruption ends in tragedy, raising questions about activist Tamara Ellis's role in escalating tensions. Hargrove exhaled a plume of smoke, satisfaction curling in his chest as he pictured the city turning on her, blaming her for the deaths. They weren't done yet, though. They needed her locked up, out of sight, before the feds could sniff around the Sioux. Cops arrived minutes later, their lights flashing as they cordoned off the lot. But Hargrove had already briefed the responding officers, 2 loyal grunts who'd done his bidding before. They stormed the scene, ignoring witnesses pointing to the fleeing truck, and zeroed in on Tamara. She stood dazed, her arm dripping blood onto the pavement, Keisha begging them to get her to a hospital. Instead, they cuffed her, the metal biting. into her wounded flesh as they barked charges of inciting a riot. They claimed she'd planned the rally to provoke unrest, that the shooting was her fault, twisting her words from the stage into a fabricated call for violence. The crowd shouted in protest, but the cops shoved her into a squad car, her cries muffled by the slamming door. Judge Warren Caldwell was waiting at the precinct, his hands trembling as he scrawled another order at Hargrove's command. The call had come an hour before the rally, a promise of cash to keep his debts at bay if he buried Tamara once more. He denied her bail again, his voice flat as he labeled her a flight risk and a public threat, citing the riot and the deaths as proof. Tamara was hauled back to a cell, her arm untreated, her spirit battered as the precinct buzzed with the news. Hargrove leaned against the car, lighting another cigarette as Tate scrolled through the Channel 7 footage, the city's outrage shifting from them to her. They'd turned her rally into a massacre, her freedom into a cage, and Ironvale was swallowing the lie whole. Tamara Ellis slumped against the cold concrete wall of her Ironvale cell, her left arm throbbing where the bullet had grazed it during the rally, the untreated wound now a dull ache beneath a makeshift bandage torn from her pajama sleeve. The cell's dank air pressed against her lungs, heavy with the stink of mold and hopelessness, the fluorescent buzz overhead a constant taunt to her frayed nerves. Blood still stained her fingers from the chaos of the drive-by, her mind replaying the screams, the sight of the teenage boy and elderly woman crumpling to the ground, their lives snuffed out in a hail of bullets meant for her. She'd been cuffed and hauled back here on charges of inciting a riot. Hargrove and Tate's latest lie pinning the deaths on her, twisting her rally into a fabricated call for violence. Judge Caldwell's gavel had sealed her fate again, denying bail with a hollow voice, leaving her trapped once more in this grimy cage. The weight of it all threatened to crush her, her chest tight with guilt and rage as she pictured Keisha's tear-streaked face, Malik's small hands clutching his mother as the cops dragged her away. She'd fought so hard, clawed her way out of their last frame-up with the drug charges, only to be slammed back into this nightmare. Hargrove's smirk haunted her, his whispered threat from the raid echoing in her ears. She should have known her place. But even as despair gnawed at her bones, a spark of defiance flared, fueled by the memory of the crowd's chants, the flickering hope that Ironvale still believed in her. She couldn't let them win, couldn't let those deaths be for nothing. She needed evidence, something concrete to shatter their lies, and she needed it fast before the system buried her for good. Her only lifeline was the burner phone, still hidden under her mattress from her last stint in jail, a secret she'd guarded with every ounce of cunning she had left. Officer Nadia Brooks had slipped it to her then, a quiet act of rebellion against the precinct's corruption, and Tamara prayed it still worked. Late that night, as the cell block settled into a restless hush, she fished it out with trembling hands, the cracked screen flickering to life as she crouched in the shadows. Nadia patrolled the hall, her boots soft against the floor, her brown eyes meeting Tamara's through the bars with a nod of understanding. Tamara dialed Lena Harper's number, her breath shallow as the line rang, each second stretching into eternity until Lena's voice crackled through, sharp and urgent despite the hour. Tamara's words spilled out in a hoarse whisper, detailing the rally, the shooting, the arrest, her voice breaking as she begged Lena to keep digging. She told her about Hargrove's presence at every turn, Tate's laughter as they cuffed her, Caldwell's complicity in denying bail. Lena listened, her silence heavy with resolve, and promised to find something, anything, to blow the case apart. The call lasted 3 minutes before Nadia signaled to hang up, her shadow disappearing down the corridor as Tamara stashed the phone, her heart pounding with fragile hope. She didn't know what Lena could uncover, but she trusted her, trusted the journalist's tenacity to unearth the truth buried under Ironvale's rot. Lena Harper didn't waste a second, her apartment a whirlwind of papers and cigarette stubs, as she tore into the story with a ferocity that matched Tamara's own. She started with the rally, interviewing witnesses who'd seen the black pickup speed away, their accounts contradicting the cops' claim that Tamara had provoked the violence. But she needed more, something undeniable, and her gut told her to dig into Judge Caldwell. He was the weak link, a man whose rulings always tilted Hargrove's way, his hands too clean for a city this dirty. Lena called in a favor with a disgruntled court clerk named Marla Evans, a woman she'd met years ago over a story about rigged evictions. Marla hated Caldwell, hated his arrogance and the whispers of his gambling debts, and she'd been waiting for a chance to stick it to him. Marla met Lena in a dimly lit diner at the edge of Ironvale, her nervous fingers clutching a coffee mug as she slid a USB drive across the table. She'd recorded a conversation months back, she said, her voice low and shaky, a late-night exchange in Caldwell's chambers she'd overheard while working overtime. Lena plugged the drive into her laptop right there, her breath catching as Hargrove's voice crackled through her earbuds, smug and commanding, as he promised Caldwell $10,000 to rig Tamara's first trial, the embezzlement case she'd beaten. Caldwell's reply was a stammering agreement, his desperation palpable as he begged for more to cover his debts. It was gold, a smoking gun that tied Hargrove to the judge, proving their corruption went deeper than anyone had guessed. Lena didn't stop there, burning through the night to corroborate the recording. She tracked down a bookie who confirmed Caldwell's losses at a backroom casino, thousands piled up over months, and a bank statement showing mysterious deposits. That matched Hargrove's timeline. She packaged it all, the recording, the witnesses, the paper trail, and sent it to Tamara's attorney, Marcus Wells, with a note to move fast. Marcus filed an emergency motion the next morning, demanding a new hearing with the evidence, arguing Tamara's arrest was part of a broader conspiracy. The motion landed in federal court, too big for Ironvale's tainted judges, and Lena leaked the recording to the Ironvale Chronicle, letting it rip through the city like wildfire. By noon it was viral, hashtags trending, radio stations dissecting. Every word as protests flared anew outside the precinct. Tamara heard the chants through the jail's narrow window, faint but fierce, her name rising over the hum of the cell block as she clutched the burner phone, waiting for news. Marcus called late that night, his voice electric with urgency, as he told her the feds had stepped in, spooked by the recording and the public outcry. They'd pressured a state judge, a no-nonsense woman named Clara Ortiz from Cleveland, to take the case, bypassing Caldwell's grip. The hearing was set for the next day, and Tamara barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities as Nadia slipped her an extra blanket, whispering that the tide was turning. She clung to that hope, her body bruised, but her spirit clawing for one more fight. The hearing unfolded in a Cleveland courtroom, a world away from Ironvale's grime, its polished wood and stern air, a stark contrast to her cell. Tamara sat beside Marcus, her arm in a sling from the gunshot, her eyes locked on Judge Ortiz as Marcus presented the evidence. He played the recording, Hargrove's voice booming through the room, Caldwell's stammering confession drawing gasps. From the gallery, Lena took the stand, her testimony meticulous, as she laid out the paper trail, the bookie's account, the rally witnesses who swore the shooting came from outside. The prosecution floundered, their riot charges crumbling under the weight of the truth, unable to counter the conspiracy laid bare. Judge Ortiz deliberated for an hour, her ruling crisp and final. The charges were dismissed, the evidence tainted by corruption, and Tamara was free, effective immediately. The courtroom erupted, cheers echoing as federal marshals moved to investigate Hargrove and Caldwell on the spot. Tamara stumbled out into the sunlight, Keisha and Malik rushing to her, their hugs a lifeline as reporters swarmed, shouting questions. She barely heard. Lena grinned from the sidelines, her notepad already filling with the next chapter, while national headlines picked up the story, painting Tamara as a hero who'd exposed Ironvale's rot. She breathed free air again, the city rallying behind her, and for a moment she thought she was safe, that the feds would finish what she'd started. But as she climbed into Keisha's car, a shadow lingered in her mind. Hargrove's absence from the hearing, a silent alarm. He'd lost, but he wasn't done. But he wasn't. If you believe Tamara's evidence turned the tables on these crooks, comment number 1 below. Should she trust the feds to clean up Ironvale, or is Hargrove still lurking with one last trick? Hit like and subscribe to find out, because this fight's about to explode. What happens when a cornered cop decides to play his deadliest card? Detective Victor Hargrove crouched in the shadowed husk of an abandoned warehouse on Ironvale's riverfront, the Ohio River's sluggish current lapping against the rotting docks outside. The air hung heavy with the stench of damp wood and diesel, the building's cracked walls groaning under decades of neglect. His sharp features were taut with desperation, his cold eyes glinting in the faint moonlight that slipped through shattered windows. Officer Roland Tate paced nearby, his hulking frame restless as he kicked at a pile of broken crates, splinters scattering across the concrete floor. His bruised knuckles flexed around a half-empty bottle of whiskey, the liquid sloshing as he muttered curses under his breath. Tamara Ellis's latest victory had hit them like a sledgehammer. Her release from jail on national news, the recording of their bribe to Judge Caldwell echoing through every radio in Ironvale, federal agents now sniffing around their precinct, like bloodhounds. Hargrove lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the sweat beading on his brow as he exhaled a shaky plume of smoke. The feds were closing in, their questions sharper, their warrants broader, every move he'd made unraveling under the spotlight Tamara had forced upon them. The rally shooting hadn't broken her, the riot charges hadn't stuck, even Caldwell's. Collapse in court had only tightened the noose around their necks. Tate slammed the bottle onto a rusted table, the glass cracking as he snarled about how they'd lost everything, the bribes, the fear, the control. The Ironvale Chronicle was calling Tamara a hero, protests swelling with every headline, and the precinct buzzed with whispers of indictments. Hargrove crushed the cigarette under his boot, his smirk gone, replaced by a grimace of raw panic. They weren't just losing, they were cornered, and cornered animals didn't slink away. They fought. Tate's rant cut off as Hargrove's voice sliced through low and lethal, laying out a plan born of desperation and spite. They'd kidnap Keisha Ellis, Tamara's sister, the one weak spot she'd never hardened against their blows. They'd lure Tamara into a trap, kill them both, and stage it as a drug deal gone wrong, burying the scandal in a blaze of chaos. Hargrove's mind raced, calculating every step as Tate's grin returned, slow and vicious, his whiskey-soaked breath fogging the air. They'd use the warehouse, a forgotten relic no one would search, rig it with explosives to erase the evidence, and leak Tamara's location to the feds as a final twist, framing her one last time. It was reckless, insane even, but it was all they had left, a last roll of the dice to take her down with them. Hargrove pulled out his burner phone, his fingers steady despite the tremor in his gut, and dialed a number he'd sworn never to use, again. It was Vince Malone, the hitman who'd botched the rally shooting, leaving Tamara alive and 2 bystanders dead. Vince picked up, his voice a flat rasp, and Hargrove offered him $10,000 to grab Keisha from her Clover Heights apartment that night. No questions, no mistakes. Vince grunted his assent, the line going dead as Hargrove pocketed the phone, his pulse hammering with a mix of dread and resolve. Tate took the next step, rummaging through a duffel bag stashed in the warehouse corner, pulling out wires, timers, and a brick of C4 he'd swiped from a bust years back. He set to work rigging the explosives, his thick fingers surprisingly deft as he muttered about blowing the place sky-high once the sisters were inside. By midnight, Vince made his move. A silent shadow slipping through Clover Heights darkened. Alice. Keisha's apartment was quiet, the lights off. Malik asleep in his tiny bedroom as she dozed on the couch, exhausted from days of worry over Tamara. Vince jimmied the lock with a practiced flick, his lean frame clad in black as he crept. Inside, a chloroform-soaked rag clutched in his gloved hand. Keisha stirred at the faint creak of the floor, her eyes fluttering open just as he pressed the rag to her face, her muffled cry dying as she went limp. Malik didn't wake, his snores undisturbed as Vince hoisted Keisha over his shoulder, slipping, out the back door and into a waiting van. He drove straight to the warehouse, dumping her bound and gagged in the center of the concrete floor, her wrists tied with zip ties, her mouth sealed with duct tape. Hargrove and Tate were waiting, their faces grim as Vince handed over a phone he'd used to record a video of Keisha, her unconscious form slumped against a crate, the warehouse's rusted beams looming behind her. Hargrove sent the clip to Tamara from an untraceable number, attaching a message. "Come alone to the riverfront warehouse by dawn or she dies." He knew she'd come, knew her love for her sister would override any caution, and that was the point. Tate tested the explosives, the timer's red digits glowing as he set it for 6 hours. enough time to trap Tamara and vanish before the blast. They'd parked a second car 2 miles away, a beat-up sedan to ditch after the job, and planned to leak Tamara's location to the feds through a burner tip, claiming she'd been spotted dealing drugs at the warehouse. The explosion would erase the truth, leaving her name smeared in the ashes. Tamara got the video at 3 in the morning, her phone buzzing on the safe house table where she'd been crashing since her release. She'd been restless, unable to sleep with the feds circling and Hargrove's silence gnawing at her, and the sight of Keisha's bound figure hit her like a punch to the gut. Her hands shook as she watched, the grainy footage showing her sister's chest rising and falling, alive but helpless. The warehouse's eerie stillness a backdrop to her terror. The message demanded she come alone, no cops, no feds, and she knew it was a trap, knew Hargrove's hand was behind it. But Keisha's life hung in the balance, and Tamara couldn't wait, couldn't risk losing her after everything they'd endured. She grabbed a kitchen knife, the only weapon she could find, and slipped out into the night, her heart pounding as she drove Keisha's car toward the riverfront, the city's lights fading behind her. Hargrove watched from the warehouse's upper level, a rusted catwalk giving him a clear view of the floor below where Keisha lay. Tate stood beside him, whiskey bottle discarded, his eyes gleaming with a savage thrill as headlights flickered in the distance. They'd hired 2 of Vince's crew to guard the perimeter, lowlifes with switchblades and twitchy trigger fingers, stationed at the warehouse's entrances to ensure Tamara didn't bring backup. Hargrove checked his watch, the timer ticking down to 5 hours. The explosives hidden beneath a tarp in the corner, wired to blow the moment they were ready to bolt. He'd seen the feds' cars prowling Ironvale earlier, their presence a ticking clock of its own, and knew this had to work. If it didn't, they'd be in cuffs by sunrise, their empire dust. Tamara's car rolled to a stop 50 yards from the warehouse, its engine cutting off as she stepped out, the knife tucked into her waistband. Her breath fogging in the chilly air, she scanned the shadows, her arm still sore from the rally wound, every instinct screaming to run, but Keisha's face drove her forward. Hargrove smirked from above, his cigarette glowing as he muttered to Tate that she'd walked right into it just like he'd known she would. The guards tensed at their posts, ready to pounce if she tried anything, while Vince slipped out the back, his payment secured, leaving the cops to finish the job. Tate cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the stillness, as they waited for Tamara to step inside, the trap set, the countdown running, and Ironvale's fate hanging on the edge of a blade. Hargrove dialed the Fed tip line from another burner, his voice disguised with a rasp as he reported a drug deal at the warehouse, naming Tamara as the ringleader. He hung up, satisfaction curling in his chest as he pictured the agents racing to the scene, too late to stop the blast but in time to find her corpse. Tate laughed low, his grin a twisted mirror of Hargrove's as they descended the catwalk, ready to greet their prey. They'd lost too much to let her live, and this was their last stand, a final deadly gambit to bury her and their sins in one fiery grave. Tamara Ellis gripped the steering wheel of Keisha's beat-up sedan, her knuckles whitening as she stared at the grainy video looping on her phone, Keisha's bound and gagged form slumped against a crate in the shadowy warehouse. The timestamp glowed red. 4 hours ago. Her chest tightened with every shallow breath, the kitchen knife tucked into her waistband, a cold comfort against the terror clawing at her insides. The riverfront loomed ahead, its abandoned warehouses hulking silhouettes. Against the pre-dawn sky, the Ohio River's sluggish churn a faint murmur over the hum of her engine. She'd slipped out of the safe house without waking Malik, leaving a scribbled note for Lena Harper in case she didn't make it back. Hargrove's message had been clear: come alone, or Keisha dies. She knew it was a trap, knew he'd rigged something deadly, but her sister's life was a tether she couldn't cut. She parked 50 yards from the warehouse, cutting the engine as her eyes scanned the shadows, the faint glow of a cigarette stub flickering on the upper catwalk. Her arm throbbed from the rally wound, the bandage stiff with dried blood, but she shoved the pain aside, stepping out into the chilly air with the knife gripped tight. The gravel crunched under her sneakers as she crept closer, every rustle of wind making her flinch, her mind racing to piece together a plan. She couldn't call the feds, couldn't risk Keisha's life on their slow bureaucracy, but she wasn't alone. Lena Harper and Officer Nadia Brooks were her last cards, and she texted them both from the car, sending the video and a desperate plea: warehouse, riverfront, now. She prayed they'd come, prayed they'd bring help, but she couldn't. Wait. Time was bleeding out with every tick of the unseen clock. Inside the warehouse, Keisha stirred on the cold concrete, her wrists raw from the zip ties, her mouth dry behind the duct tape. Her head pounded from the chloroform, her vision blurry as she squinted at the rusted beams overhead, the faint hum of a timer ticking somewhere in the dark. Hargrove and Tate loomed on the catwalk above, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight, whispering plans she couldn't hear. 2 guards patrolled below, hired muscle with switchblades glinting in their hands, their boots scuffing the floor as they watched the entrances. Keisha's heart sank as she recognized the setup. They weren't just holding her. They were waiting for Tamara, and the explosives under the tarp in the corner promised a death she couldn't escape. Tamara reached the warehouse's rusted side door, her breath fogging as she pressed her ear to the metal, catching the low murmur of voices inside. She slipped her phone from her pocket, texting Lena and Nadia one last time. "Inside now, guards, hurry." She didn't wait for a reply, easing the door open with a creak that made her wince, slipping into the shadows as the guards' heads snapped toward the sound. The interior was a maze of crates and broken machinery, the air thick with dust and the faint tang of gasoline. She spotted Keisha in the center, her sister's eyes widening with panic as they met hers, a muffled cry stifled by the tape. Tamara's pulse hammered as she ducked behind a stack of barrels, her knife trembling in her hand as she mapped her move. The guards were sloppy, their attention split between the entrances, and Tamara seized the gap. She darted low across the floor, her sneakers silent on the concrete as she reached Keisha, slicing through the zip ties with quick, desperate strokes. Keisha gasped as the tape came off, her voice a ragged whisper as she clutched Tamara's arm, warning her about the bomb, the timer, the cops above. Tamara nodded, her jaw tight as she pulled Keisha to her feet, guiding her toward the back door she'd spotted in the video, its rusty hinges a faint outline in the gloom. But the guards caught the movement, one shouting as he lunged, his switchblade flashing in the dim light. Tamara shoved Keisha behind her, swinging the knife in a wild arc that caught the guard's forearm, blood spraying as he staggered back, with a howl. The second guard charged, his blade slashing toward her chest, but she ducked, driving her shoulder into his gut and sending him crashing into a crate. Keisha stumbled toward the door, her legs shaky as Tamara fought, her rally wound screaming with every move. Hargrove's voice barked from the catwalk, sharp with rage, as he ordered Tate to cut them off, their boots clanging down the metal stairs. Tamara grabbed Keisha's hand, sprinting for the exit as the guards scrambled to their feet. The warehouse a chaos of shouts and pounding footsteps. They burst through the back door into the alley, the cold air hitting them like a slap as Tamara scanned for cover, spotting a dumpster 10 yards away. She pulled Keisha behind it, her breath ragged as she peeked out, seeing Hargrove and Tate emerge, their guns drawn, fury twisting their faces. The timer's hum grew louder in her mind, though she couldn't see it, the seconds ticking down to a blast she couldn't outrun. Then headlights pierced the darkness, a car screeching to a stop at the alley's mouth, Lena Harper leaping out with Nadia Brooks at her side, Nadia's service pistol raised as she shouted for Hargrove to freeze. Lena had called the feds and rout, her phone still clutched in her hand, but they were minutes away, too far to stop the chaos unfolding now. Hargrove spun, his gun barking as he fired at Nadia, the bullet pinging off the dumpster as she ducked, returning fire with a shot. That grazed his shoulder. Tate roared, charging at Tamara and Keisha, his bulk a freight train of muscle and spite. Tamara lunged, driving her knife into his thigh, the blade sinking deep as he bellowed, stumbling to his knees. Keisha kicked at his hand, sending his gun, skittering across the gravel as Nadia tackled the first guard, cuffing him with a swift twist. Lena grabbed the second, slamming his head against the dumpster with a crack that left him limp, her wiry strength surprising even herself. The warehouse shuddered then, a deep rumble rolling through the ground as the explosives detonated, the blast tearing through the far wall in a fireball of orange and black. Tamara threw herself over Keisha, debris raining down as the structure buckled, half the building collapsing in a roar of flame and dust. She coughed, her ears ringing as she dragged Keisha to her feet, staggering toward Lena's car as Nadia hauled Tate into cuffs, his blood pooling on the gravel. Hargrove vanished in the chaos, slipping into the shadows as the flames lit the night, his shoulder wound, slowing him but not stopping him. The feds arrived seconds later, their sirens a belated wail as they swarmed the scene, securing Tate and the guards, their radios crackling with orders to find Hargrove. Tamara collapsed against the car, Keisha clinging to her as Lena checked her pulse, her grey curls wild with soot. Nadia holstered her gun, her face grim as she reported Hargrove's escape, the feds fanning out to search the riverfront. The warehouse burned, its skeleton glowing against the dawn, a testament to how close they'd come to death. Tamara's arm bled through her bandage, her body shaking with adrenaline and relief as she held Keisha tight, whispering apologies into her hair. The city hailed her as a hero by morning, the Ironvale Chronicle splashing the rescue across its pages, protests erupting anew as Tate's arrest fueled demands for justice. She thought it was over, thought Hargrove's flight meant the end, her breath steadying as the feds promised to hunt him down. But as the sun rose over Ironvale, a chill lingered in her bones. Hargrove was out there, wounded but alive, and she knew he'd never stop. The warehouse was gone, Tate was in cuffs, but the war wasn't won. She'd saved her sister, defied their trap, but the cost was etched in the blood on her hands, the flames still flickering in her mind. She leaned against Keisha, exhaustion pulling at her edges, and wondered how much more she could take before the next blow landed. Judge Warren Caldwell sat hunched over his mahogany desk in the dimly lit chambers of the Ironvale courthouse, his trembling hands clutching a glass of bourbon that sloshed with every shaky breath. The room was a fortress of dark wood and legal tomes, its thick Persian rug muffling the distant hum of the city beyond the tall windows, but it offered no comfort tonight. Sweat beaded on his balding scalp, his bloodshot eyes darting to the framed photos of his wife and daughters, their frozen smiles a silent accusation he couldn't escape. The federal probe had tightened its grip since Tamara Ellis's escape from the warehouse explosion. The recording of his bribe from Hargrove now a noose around his neck. Every news outlet in Ohio replaying his stammering voice. Detective Victor. Hargrove was a fugitive. Officer Roland Tate was in cuffs, and Caldwell's world was crumbling faster than he could drown it in liquor. His phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with an unlisted number he knew too well. Hargrove's voice rasped through the line, low and jagged with pain from his shoulder wound, but sharp with a desperation that cut deeper than any bullet. Caldwell's stomach lurched as Hargrove barked orders, his words a venomous hiss. Frame. Tamara one last time. Plant evidence to pin the warehouse blast on her, or he'd leak every dirty deal Caldwell had ever made, every bribe, every hushed-up DUI. The judge's glass slipped, spilling bourbon across his blotter as he stammered, "I protest." But Hargrove cut him off, promising cash and a way out if he complied, threatening ruin if he didn't. The line went dead, leaving Caldwell staring at the amber puddle soaking his papers, his breath hitching as guilt and greed warred in his chest. He'd been in Hargrove's pocket too long, his gambling debts a chain that had dragged him into this abyss. The first bribe had been small, a few hundred to look the other way on a minor case, but it had snowballed into thousands, into framing Tamara for embezzlement, denying her bail, rigging her fate to keep Hargrove's empire intact. Now the feds were knocking, their questions circling his rulings, and the warehouse explosion had lit Ironvale ablaze with outrage. Tamara's rescue of Keisha, Tate's arrest, the viral footage of the burning wreckage, it all pointed back to him, a trail he couldn't erase. Hargrove's plan was madness, a last gasp from a dying beast, but Caldwell was too deep to climb out. He downed the last of his bourbon, the burn steadying his nerves, and resolved to do it, one final sin to save his skin. By dawn, Caldwell had doctored the evidence, his hands steadying as he slipped into the role he'd played too many times. He forged a report claiming Tamara had orchestrated the warehouse blast as a publicity stunt to fuel her activism, citing fabricated witness statements from junkies he'd paid off years ago for similar jobs. He planted a singed backpack in the precinct's evidence lockup, stuffing it with fake bomb-making manuals and a burner phone linked to her name, timestamps manipulated to match the explosion. It was sloppy, rushed, but Hargrove's blackmail left no room for finesse. Caldwell filed it with the feds through a back channel, a corrupt agent Hargrove had on speed dial, ensuring it hit their desks before the sun rose over Ironvale's jagged skyline. Hargrove, meanwhile, hid in a rotting motel 10 miles outside town, his shoulder wrapped in a bloody rag, his sharp features gaunt with exhaustion and rage. He'd slipped away as the warehouse burned, dodging feds and dogs through the riverfront's maze of alleys, his mind churning with every step. Tate's arrest was a gut punch, the explosives a wasted gambit. But Tamara's survival was the real wound, her face on every TV screen a taunt he couldn't stomach. He'd called Caldwell from a payphone, his voice a growl as he laid out the frame-up, knowing the judge's fear would bend him one last time. Hargrove clutched a stolen pistol, its weight a cold promise as he waited for the plan to unfold. His last stand a desperate bid to bury her before the feds buried him. The feds moved fast, their black SUVs rolling into Ironvale by mid-morning, agents swarming the safe house where Tamara had crashed after the rescue. She was still bandaged, her arm in a sling, Keisha asleep beside her on a cot, when they kicked in the door, shouting orders as they dragged her out in cuffs. Lena Harper lunged forward, her grey curls wild as she demanded answers, but the agents shoved her back, their warrant citing terrorism charges tied to the warehouse blast. Tamara's heart sank as they read the accusations, orchestrating the explosion, endangering lives, all backed by the planted backpack and forged reports. Keisha woke screaming, Malik clinging to her leg as the feds hauled Tamara away, her knife-scarred hands shaking in the steel bracelets. Caldwell presided over the federal hearing that afternoon, his chambers swapped for a sterile courtroom in Cleveland, the case too hot for Ironvale's tainted benches. He sat rigid behind the bench, his robes a shroud over his trembling frame, his eyes avoiding Tamara's as she stood beside Marcus Wells, her attorney's face tight with fury. The feds presented their evidence, the backpack's singed contents laid out like a trophy, the burner phone's logs a damning web of lies. Marcus objected, his voice sharp as he pointed out the inconsistencies. No fingerprints, no witnesses who'd seen her near the warehouse before the rescue, no motive beyond the prosecution's wild claims. But Caldwell overruled him, his gavel a heavy thud as he admitted the evidence, his voice flat with rehearsed authority. Tamara's stomach twisted as the hearing stretched into hours, the feds painting her as a radical who'd staged the blast. To martyr herself, the deaths of the rally victims twisted into her narrative. The city turned against her overnight, the Ironvale Chronicle running a split headline, Hero or Terrorist. Protests faltered, neighbors who'd chanted her name now whispering doubts, the viral recording of Hargrove's bribe drowned out by the new accusations. Marcus fought, calling Lena to the stand, her testimony fierce as she swore Tamara had. Saved Keisha, not bombed the warehouse, but Caldwell dismissed it as hearsay. His rulings a wall no truth could breach. Tamara watched him, her eyes burning into his, sensing the fear behind his mask, the guilt he couldn't hide. Hargrove watched it unfold from his motel, the grainy TV flickering with live coverage, his smirk returning despite the pain pulsing in his shoulder. He'd tipped off Channel 7 through Carla Ortiz, ensuring cameras caught Tamara's arrest, the footage looping with pundits debating her guilt. Ironvale swallowed it, the city's faith in her crumbling as the feds pushed. For life in prison, Caldwell's denial of bail a final nail in her coffin. Hargrove lit a cigarette, the smoke curling around his gaunt face as he muttered to himself, satisfaction drowning out the sirens he knew were closing in. He'd lost Tate, lost the warehouse, but if Tamara went down, it was worth it. A Pyrrhic. Victory to spit in her face one last time. Caldwell rushed the trial date, setting it for 3 days later, his chambers a blur of bourbon and panic as he finalized the frame-up. He forged more documents overnight, witness affidavits from ghosts who'd never testify, his signature trembling but legible as he stacked the deck. The feds didn't question it, their agent in Hargrove's pocket greasing the wheels, the rest too eager to close a case that had spiraled out of control. Tamara sat in a Cleveland holding cell, Her arm untreated, her spirit battered as the walls closed in again. She'd saved Keisha, defied the trap, but now faced a lie she couldn't outrun. The city's cheers turning to jeers as Hargrove's shadow loomed larger than ever. By the third day, Ironvale was a powder keg, protests shrinking to scattered clusters. The Chronicle's pages thick with editorials blaming Tamara for the chaos. Lena pounded on doors, begging witnesses to come forward, but fear silenced them. The Fed's presence a gag on the truth. Marcus prepared for trial, his briefcase stuffed with notes he knew Caldwell would bury, his voice hoarse as he promised Tamara they'd fight. She nodded, her jaw tight, but doubt gnawed at her. The weight of Hargrove's last stand pressing, down like a stone. She faced life in prison, her name smeared, her allies faltering, and wondered if this was the end, if Ironvale's corruption had finally won. Tamara Ellis stood in the sterile glare of a federal courtroom in Cleveland. Her wrists chafed raw from the cuffs that bound her, her left arm still throbbing beneath a sling from the rally shooting. The polished wood and high ceilings dwarfed her, a stark contrast to the grimy Ironvale cells she'd endured, but the weight of the terrorism charges pressed down heavier than any concrete wall. Her trial had begun at dawn, the gallery packed with reporters and protesters, their murmurs a low hum beneath the judge's gavel. She wore a borrowed blazer from Lena Harper, its sleeves too long, her hair pulled back in a tight bun that hid, the exhaustion etched into her face. Marcus Wells stood beside her, his briefcase open on the defense table, papers spilling out as he prepared to fight a case rigged to bury her alive. Keisha and Malik sat in the front row, their eyes red from sleepless nights, their hands clasped tight as they watched her face a life sentence for a crime she hadn't committed. Judge Clara Ortiz presided, her stern gaze cutting through the room from behind thick glasses, her grey hair pinned in a severe knot. She'd taken the case from Ironvale's corrupt grasp, her reputation as a no-nonsense arbiter of truth, a faint hope Tamara clung to as the prosecution laid out their lies. The federal agent leading the charge, a square-jawed man named Agent Paulson, stood tall in his crisp suit presenting the singed backpack Judge Warren Caldwell had planted, its fake bomb-making manuals and burner phone waved like a flag of guilt. He painted Tamara as a terrorist mastermind, claiming she'd staged the warehouse explosion to fuel her activism, the deaths of the rally victims twisted into a narrative of her reckless ambition. Marcus objected, his voice sharp as he pointed out the lack of fingerprints, the absence of credible witnesses, but Paulson pressed on, his evidence a house of cards built on Caldwell's forgery and Hargrove's desperation. Tamara's chest tightened as the hours dragged, her mind flashing. To the warehouse, the flames, Keisha's terrified face as they'd escaped. She'd saved her sister, defied Hargrove's trap, only to be slammed with this final frame-up, the city's faith in her shattered by headlines and whispers. The Ironvale Chronicle had turned, its pages now questioning her innocence, protests, dwindling to a handful of diehards outside the courthouse. She glanced at Lena in the gallery, her grey curls wild as she scribbled notes, her jaw set with the determination that kept Tamara's hope flickering. Marcus called their first witness, a Clover Heights resident who'd seen the black pickup at the rally, his testimony shaky but clear. The shooting came from outside, not Tamara's doing. Ortiz listened, her pen scratching notes, but Paulson dismissed it as irrelevant, his confidence unshaken. The tide shifted when Marcus played the warehouse footage, a grainy clip Lena had pieced together from a bystander's phone, smuggled out before the feds could bury it. The screen flickered to life, showing Tamara dragging Keisha from the burning wreckage, debris raining as the explosives roared, her arm bleeding as she shielded her sister. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, the image clashing with Paulson's. Tale of a calculated bomber. Marcus pressed the point, his voice rising as he argued no terrorist would risk their life to save another, no mastermind would leave such chaos unplanned. Ortiz's brow furrowed, her gaze flicking to Paulson as he stammered, claiming the footage was staged, but the cracks in his story widened, the jury's faces tightening with doubt. Lena took the stand next, her testimony a razor cutting through the prosecution's fog. She detailed the recording of Hargrove bribing Caldwell, her voice steady as she recounted tracking the judge's debts, the bookie's confirmation, the bank deposits that matched the timeline. She swore Tamara had been targeted from the start. The embezzlement, the CPS raid, the firebombing, all pieces of a corrupt puzzle Hargrove had built to silence her. Paulson objected, his face reddening as he called her biased, but Ortiz overruled, her eyes narrowing as she demanded the recording be played again. Hargrove's smug voice filled the room, promising Caldwell cash to rig the first trial, the judge's stammering assent, a damning echo that silenced the gallery. Tamara watched. Caldwell's empty seat in the witness box, his absence a void she knew Hargrove had exploited. The real blow came when Marcus revealed Lena's latest coup. Hargrove's hideout, a rotting motel 10 miles from Ironvale, tracked through a tip from a gas station clerk who'd seen his bloodied shoulder. Lena had alerted the feds mid-trial, her phone call sparking a raid that unfolded as the courtroom waited. At 10:45, agents stormed the motel, dragging Hargrove out in cuffs, his stolen pistol clattering to the floor, his gaunt face twisted with fury as they hauled him to Cleveland. Ortiz called a recess, the jury filing out as marshals brought Hargrove into the courtroom, his shoulder bandaged, his eyes burning into Tamara with a hatred that chilled her blood. The gallery erupted, reporters shouting as cameras flashed. The chaos a storm she barely registered. The trial resumed with Hargrove in custody, his presence a weight that shifted the room's gravity. Marcus seized the moment, calling Caldwell to the stand. The judge subpoenaed overnight after the motel raid, his bourbon-soaked nerves no match for federal pressure. Caldwell shuffled in, his robes gone, his balding head bowed as he took the oath, his hands trembling on the rail. Marcus didn't relent, his questions a barrage that stripped Caldwell bare. When did Hargrove first bribe you? How much did he pay to frame Tamara? What did he threaten to keep you in line? Caldwell's voice cracked, his eyes darting to Hargrove. As he confessed, the words spilling like a burst dam. He admitted to the embezzlement setup, the drug charge bail denial, the warehouse forgery, $10,000 here, threats of exposure there. A decade of corruption laid bare in a flood of shame. The courtroom froze as Caldwell broke, his sobs echoing as he detailed Hargrove's orders, Tate's complicity, the junkies paid to lie, the backpack planted to seal Tamara's fate. Paulson lunged to object, his voice shrill as he claimed coercion, but Ortiz silenced him with a glare, her gavel a thunderclap as she ordered Caldwell to continue. He named dates, amounts, every dirty deal that had kept Ironvale's underbelly thriving, his confession a wrecking ball that smashed the prosecution's case to dust. Tamara's breath caught, her eyes welling as Keisha gripped Malik's hand, their tears silent but fierce. Hargrove sprang up, shouting curses as marshals wrestled him back, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Caldwell's words. Ortiz deliberated for 30 minutes, the courtroom holding its breath as she returned, her ruling crisp and final. All charges against Tamara Ellis were dropped, the evidence tainted by corruption, Hargrove and Caldwell's conspiracy proven beyond doubt. The gallery exploded, cheers drowning out Paulson's protests as marshals cuffed Caldwell mid-sob, his career a ruin as they led him away. Tamara exhaled, her knees buckling as Marcus steadied her, Keisha and Malik rushing to her side, their arms a tangle of relief and love. Lena grinned from the back, her notepad stuffed with the story that would dominate headlines for weeks, the Ironvale Chronicle already scrambling to retract its doubts. The feds hauled Hargrove and Caldwell to a holding cell, their fates sealed. As indictments piled up, conspiracy, bribery, evidence tampering, murder for the rally deaths, Tate faced his own trial, his warehouse arrest a footnote to the collapse of their empire. Ironvale buzzed with Tamara's victory, protests swelling anew as the city demanded reform, the Chronicle dubbing her the woman who toppled corruption. She stepped outside, the Cleveland sun warm on her face, reporters swarming as she waved. Them off, her voice steady as she thanked her allies, her family. The truth that had set her free, she thought it was over, thought the nightmare had ended, until a call came that afternoon, the governor's office on the line with a twist no one saw coming. 2 weeks later, Ironvale's district attorney resigned under federal pressure, the corruption probe exposing a web too tangled to salvage. The governor, spurred by public outcry and Tamara's story, announced a sweeping overhaul of the city's justice system, appointing a special investigator to root out the rot. To everyone's astonishment, he named Tamara Ellis, her paralegal grit and courtroom battles a resume no one could match. She'd oversee the police department, audit cases, recommend charges against officers who'd abused their power, a role that made her Hargrove and Tate's boss as they rotted in jail awaiting trial. The city marveled at the irony. The woman they'd framed now holding the reins, her voice a thunderclap in a system she'd vowed to rebuild. Tamara walked into her new office at the Ironvale Police Department 3 days later, the corner room once Hargrove's domain now hers, its walls bare but for a single photo of Keisha and Malik pinned above her desk. Staff paused in the halls, some wary, others nodding with grudging respect as she passed, her sling gone, her arm scarred but healing. She stood at the window, the city sprawling below, and felt a tremor of triumph laced with humility, the weight of her journey sinking in. Her first act was a meeting with department heads, her tone firm as she outlined accountability measures. Her second a call to Officer Nadia Brooks, thanking her for the courage that had turned the tide. Nadia smiled through the line, promising to help root out the bad apples, a partnership forged in the fire of their fight. Hargrove and Tate were denied bail, their flight risk a lock as Caldwell's trial loomed, the media dubbing it Ironvale's reckoning. Tamara vowed to shine a light on every shadow, her office a beacon, as the city braced for more revelations. Reform began slowly, training programs rolling out, community boards forming, the Chronicle's exposés a mirror to the wounds she'd heal. She'd gone from prisoner to protector, her name a legend whispered in Clover Heights, a testament to truth's stubborn bloom. Hargrove's last gambit had failed, his empire ash, and Tamara stood tall, her scars a map of the battles she'd won, her future a promise Ironvale dared to believe. Tamara Ellis's journey through Ironvale's corrupt underbelly teaches us the raw power of resilience against systemic injustice. Her story reveals that truth, though buried under lies and violence, can claw its way to the surface when fueled by courage and community. Facing racist cops who bribed judges and planted evidence, Tamara never surrendered. Even as they escalated from legal traps to lethal strikes, each false victory, beating embezzlement charges, reclaiming her nephew from CPS, surviving a firebombing, met a harsher retaliation, yet she turned every blow into a stepping stone. This shows that fighting back isn't just about winning battles. It's about enduring the war, outlasting the oppressors until their own schemes unravel. The tale also exposes the fragility of corrupt systems when confronted with persistent resistance. Hargrove, Tate, and Caldwell thrived on fear and manipulation, but their downfall came when allies like Nadia Brooks and Lena Harper chose integrity over silence. It's a reminder that justice isn't automatic. It demands active defiance, whether from within the system or outside it. Tamara's rise to special prosecutor underscores a final lesson. Real change often comes from those who've endured the worst, their scars a blueprint for reform. So, what's the takeaway? Stand firm, seek truth, and trust that even the darkest plots can't outlast a determined spirit. What do you think? Can one person's fight topple a corrupt empire? Comment below, hit like, subscribe, and share to keep this conversation alive. Thanks for joining Tamara's epic battle. Here's to a world where justice prevails.